Hello and welcome to the third episode of the South Yorkshire Women's Football Podcast. I'm Ollie Palace.
I'm Lewis Railton.
And today we've got on South Yorkshire Women's Football historian Ruth Johnson. Lewis, what does Ruth talk about?
Ruth goes into all sorts of insight, Ollie, including her own footballing journey.
I found myself in Sheffield United's first ever women's team, which was called Sheffield United.
The struggles of Doncaster Rovers Bells.
They've really been a victim of the kind of professionalisation of the women's game.
And the origins of women's football in South Yorkshire.
It was described in the local press as a football farce and a scandalous exhibition that should never be repeated.
We'll head over to the episode now. Apologies in advance, there are a few errors with the camera on this episode, but it's still a fascinating episode nonetheless. Hello and welcome to the next episode of the South Yorkshire Women's Football Podcast. I'm Ollie Palace, joined as always by my co-hosts Lewis Railton. Lewis, hello.
How are we doing, Ollie? Good to see you again, pal.
Likewise. So we have another special guest on the show today, Ruth Johnson. How would you sort of define yourself? Just general women's football historian? Is that the best way to describe you?
That's one of the things I do, yeah. Shall I just mention that I've got 3 jobs which are all sort of relevant?
Yeah,
so
of course, go into
detail. I do
detail.
actually work at Sheffield University in the library part-time, and then I've got 2 jobs working for a local charity called Football Unites Racism Divides. One is as resources and information worker, so I run a kind of specialist library and information centre looking at issues around football inequality. And my other job there is women and girls football worker, so I kind of try and develop initiatives for women and girls to get involved in football in whatever way they want, particularly ones who are kind of being excluded at the moment or have difficulty kind of accessing other opportunities. We try and put things in place to help them.
What made you realise that there were these differences in women's football, particularly in the South Yorkshire area?
Well, I've always been aware of it because I've always been interested in football since I was a small child, when there were very few opportunities around and there was a lot of prejudice and ridicule of any girl that wanted to play. So it kind of stems from that, but through my existing work from Ferd before I started doing the women and girls football work, I was aware that there were a lot of disadvantages for certain groups for various reasons, including cultural factors, sexism, racism, Islamophobia, and financial reasons and geographical reasons. And I became a lot more aware of that very quickly when I started putting on football activities at the UMIC Centre, where we're based in Lowfield.
What's your background in football? Have you played before? Have you always been involved in some capacity, sort of coaching in other sort of initiatives that you've done?
I've always been a football fan since I was a small child, and I played when I could as a child, but that was kind of difficult. So I played with my dad and my brother. They always encouraged me. My mum made it quite clear she didn't like it. I was a terrible disappointment to her, and I came in all covered in mud and things.
One more girly girl, did she?
She did, yeah.
Whereabouts did you play?
In the garden, in the park, played in the school playground with all the boys and one other girl. But even at primary school, I wasn't allowed in the school team, even though I was clearly good enough, just because I was a girl. Joined a team for a while, who were about half an hour's drive away, but that was mainly just training. They didn't actually have a girls' team playing in a league at that time, but I loved it. It wasn't till I was in my early 20s that I got to play in the 11-a-side, really. That started at Hallam University when I was working there, actually. Joined the student club, which had just recently formed, and then that led into a partnership with Sheffield United. I found myself in Sheffield United's first ever women's team, which was called Sheffield United, in about 1993. Played for them for a few years, dropped out, life got in the way, I fell out of favour, found some 5-a-side friendlies to play in a few years later. Did that for a bit. That fizzled out because we didn't have enough players. So I kind of retired several times and kept finding new ways to get back involved. Then when I started doing the football at Ferd, initially it was a few kind of women of my sort of age. We decided if we were really gentle with each other and didn't put any pressure on, maybe we could just still have a gentle little run around.
When you first joined Sheffield United back in 93, was that really the first time in your footballing life that you've really felt like you had your own place, that you felt like you were actually accepted in an environment where you were able to play football?
Yeah, that was the first time it started to feel a little bit normalised, I suppose, that we're kind of being taken on by Sheffield United. That was a really big deal. I think we were only the second women's team in Sheffield after Sheffield Wednesday at that time. So that meant we were taken a little bit more seriously, I think. It wasn't the end of our battles, of course, but it was a big step in the right direction, certainly. Yeah. And it was great to feel part of a team after kind of just being like a lone voice, really, most of my life. Battling against the teachers and things.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose like having like, you had the same kits, the same badges, of course, as the men's team. I felt that must have felt, I don't know, like the game had come quite a distance since you had started playing it as a child.
It did, yeah. Felt really proud to be wearing the kit that the Premiership team of the time was wearing as well. So yeah, I mean, we weren't actually allowed on the pitch at first even to have our photos taken. We had to do it in the car park outside. And then later on, as a progression, they let us onto the pitch just for a photo shoot.
It's good of them, isn't it?
Very kind.
So, one step at a time.
What's the trajectory of it of women's football been like, sort of since then? And what's your experience been like from '93 to where we are now?
Well, it's been painfully slow throughout my life, but the progression has speeded up a lot. I think the first time I was fairly gobsmacked at how massive it was the Olympics, 2012 Olympics, when GB were playing in front of massive crowds, like 70,000, I think, and I just never thought I'd see that in my lifetime. So that was incredible. Since then, yeah, things have progressed massively. We've got professional women's teams now, not enough, but it's on television regularly. It's taken a lot more seriously. We've got more female pundits and commentators and referees and so on. Obviously, England winning the Euros was massive. I remember getting all sorts of messages from friends and family after that, saying how excited they'd been to watch it, like people that had never shown any interest in football before. There are still a lot of hurdles and a lot of issues, a few signs that things might possibly be going backwards. So,
What are them signs that things are potentially going backwards? Is that something across the nation? Is that something that's just happened in South Yorkshire? What have you noticed that suggests that?
Something that's just come out this week, I think, is about Blackburn Rovers. I think ditching their women's team. They're in the Championship, which I'm not sure if they're professional or semi-professional or not. I think there's a bit of a mixture in that league. But yeah, they've just announced they're ditching the women's team. I guess they think it's costing them too much and they're not important enough to invest in. I don't know all the ins and outs, but I think that is going to be an issue. And locally, of course, Sheffield United have just been relegated from that league when they were pushing for full professionalisation. So where they're going to go from here, I think remains to be seen. Sheffield Wednesday were probably a bigger women's club 30 years ago than they are now. Not in terms of number of players, but in terms of status and how they were treated by the men's club and what kind of level they played at.
In that club statement that Blackburn put out, they basically said something along the lines of attendances just haven't been what they need to be to make a sustainable model. Almost suggesting to the fact that the fans haven't come to watch it, so therefore that's why we're getting rid. Do you think it really should be on the fans to be doing that, or should the clubs, no matter what the attendance is, should they have a right, and should they basically have to give the women's team this platform?
I think they should have to give the women's team a platform. I mean, I don't know what the men get paid in clubs like Blackburn, but generally the wages that male players get paid is absolutely ridiculous. There's no need for anyone to get paid that much. What do they do with it all? I suppose they have to give 50% of it back as tax, but even so.
I wouldn't mind that over 50%. To be honest.
Chopping and changing questions, but could you tell us a little bit about the history of some of these clubs in South Yorkshire over the years? Yeah,
that reminds me, I didn't quite answer your initial question fully about how I define myself. You said, are you a women's football historian? I should have just said yes. As a bit of a side project, I've done a lot of research on the history of women's football in the Sheffield area. We called it the Stoppage Time Project, which refers to all the times that women and girls have been stopped from playing football. And that was a project that was part funded by the Sheffield Council and the FA in the run-up to the Women's Euros, which were in part based in Sheffield in 2022. So Doncaster Bells were formed in 1969, I think by some fans of the men's team who were selling raffle tickets and things at the matches and decided they wanted to go up playing. So they formed a team just before the FA ban on women playing football on affiliated grounds was lifted, which was in 1970, which had been in place for 50 years, which is one of the main reasons why women's football has lagged so far behind men's. And they went on to become the dominant force in women's football in the 80s and 90s, early 90s anyway. They've really been a victim of the kind of professionalisation of the women's game. So although all the investment in women's football has been welcome, it's had its victims as well, and Doncaster Bells were one of those, in that they should have been in the Super League on merit when the Super League was formed, but they weren't. I don't think they were even invited to join, possibly because their facilities and things weren't up to a certain standard, and they've been a bit in the wilderness ever since, but they are still going. They seem to have a thriving structure still, like lots of junior teams. One of the founder members, Sheila Edmonds, is still there after however many years it is, 50-something years. She's chair, I think, now, which is incredible. So they're an absolutely shining example of what women's football can be and how hard people have had to fight to make it what it is. Sheffield Wednesday have a really long history, which I don't think many people are aware of, possibly because it's involved a few name changes, but they formed, I think, in 1971 as a pub side in Rotherham, actually, called the Star Inn. I think they were formed to play a charity match, which I think was women against men. They got a taste for it and started playing more matches, joined the fledgling Women's League, which started in 1970, I think, for a few years. At some point they moved to Sheffield and became known as Sheffield Football Club. That was in about 1980, I think, ish. And then in about 1990, they wrote to Sheffield Wednesday and United asking if either would like to sponsor them and support them, and Wednesday got back to them and said, yes, we would. We were just thinking of starting a women's team anyway. So they got lots of support and became Sheffield Wednesday ladies at that point. Did really well, got into, I think, one of the top divisions at the time, played at Hillsborough a few times, played most of the home matches at Middlewood Training Ground, which the men's team are still at. Got a lot of support from the likes of Trevor Francis, who was the manager at the time. Got a photo of him with the women's team. They're no longer as closely associated with the men's team as they were. I'm not sure all the ins and outs of that, but they do still have a thriving women's club at Wednesday, junior teams, senior teams. And Sheffield United, as I said earlier, started Sheffield Hallam United in 1993. That lasted a few years as a partnership with Hallam University. I think that fizzled out, and then Sheffield United formed their own women's team, I think, in about 2003-ish. I think it operated as a kind of semi-independent club for quite a long time, and then in the last few years it's been taken fully on board by the men's club. They've been playing at Bramwell Lane for about the last 2-3 seasons, which was a huge bit of progress, it seemed. So whether that will carry on, I don't know. So yeah, lots of ups and lots of downs. One thing I noticed when I was researching the history was how some of that history tends to get a bit erased when they kind of co-opted by the men's team. Like if you try and find the women's team history on the men's club website, if you go to the women's section, you just find normally information about the current team, current matches, current players. If you go to the history section, you just find information about the men's team history. Even if there is, as there usually is, some kind of history of the women's team, it's really hard to find it. So just one little example of how it can be a bit of a disadvantage. There is a lack of facilities as well. As one of the things I've been finding out in trying to set up a women's team myself, such a lack of pitches and things of a decent quality in our area.
You say that you're going to make your own women's football club, is that right?
Yeah, for Football Unites Race and Divides, yeah.
Will that be 11-a-side, 5-a-side?
Yeah.
11?
Yeah.
What's sort of the motivation behind that? Is that to create your own club where you can guarantee that you can provide women a place to play football, and in spite of what the men's clubs do for their women's teams, make them the priority? Is that sort of the aim behind it, or is it perhaps something else?
It is, yeah. I mean, it's a progression route. So we run kind of casual sessions where anyone can just turn up and have a game, anyone of any age, ability, etc. And we try and accommodate everyone. We've got some really good players who aren't fulfilling their potential because they're not involved in teams. So we want to make it easy for them, not just our current players, but future generations as well. Some of them have had bad experiences with racism and Islamophobia at other clubs. Some of them just have difficulty affording the subs, and there aren't any other teams based in our area. There was Norton Wood Seats, who used to play just up the road, but they've been kind of taken over by Uttibridge as their development team, so they're miles away now, and the next closest team folded. So we think there's a need for something in our part of Sheffield, and we're also trying to get it run entirely by women. So we're trying to develop and upskill women to be coaches, managers, committee members, volunteers as well, in the hope that will kind of just do a little bit to kind of change the male dominance of football, perhaps introduce a bit of a different vibe, a bit of a gentler kind of, less macho kind of environment maybe, hopefully make it a bit safer. I've heard too many stories about inappropriate behaviour by men in women's football. It happened when I was playing and it's still happening now, so I kind of think this is one way of kind of maybe trying to reduce the risk of that happening a bit.
An incredible achievement, to be fair.
If we manage to pull it off.
Yeah.
We're just trying to raise some funding at the moment.
Could you just give us a bit of a background for people listening and watching, obviously, what the Stoppage Time project is?
It was a project to research and promote awareness of the history of women's football, particularly in the Sheffield area. Yeah, there's been quite a lot of research done in the last few years about women's football history more widely, but there didn't seem to be much information in the books I've read about the Sheffield area, and there's a really strong history of football in the Sheffield area, but there's very little about women's football in the books and things I've read about that. A few things we've found out. As far as I'm aware, the first women's match to take place in Sheffield was in 1881 at the Queen's Ground Hotel in Hillsborough. Yet another pitch that isn't there anymore. The pub's still there. It used to have a sports ground behind it. But yeah, that was between two teams claiming to represent England and Scotland that did a tour and charged people admittance. About 1,000 people went to see it. It was described in the local press as a football farce and a scandalous exhibition that should never be repeated. A couple of the other matches that they played on this tour had to be abandoned because of pitch invasions by male attendees. They had to run off into their horse-drawn omnibus to safety. So I don't think that happened in Sheffield, but that's how women's football was treated in those days. The first match I'm aware of between players who actually came from Sheffield was in 1916 on Boxing Day, which was the beginning of what turned into enough women's football in the area during the First World War to form a South Yorkshire League. I think it only ran for one season, 1917 to 1918. But the Boxing Day match attracted about 10,000 spectators to a ground that was designed for about 2,000. That was a massive deal, and that did get into the papers. Quite amusing reports written of that. Some took the match more seriously than others, but it was to raise money for wounded soldiers. After the men came back from the war, the ones that did come back, women's football seems to have mainly fizzled out. There's a few examples of matches that carried on. The FA introduced a ban in 1921 on women playing on men's affiliated grounds. So that kind of put paid to most of women's football for the next 50 years. In the early 70s, there was a women's league for about 4 or 5 seasons I think it started with 5 teams and I think grew a little bit. And then that fizzled out again. I suppose the 90s when a few more teams started to form. And then, the last few years it's increased massively as it's become more acceptable.
Can I ask you about the ban? What, in your opinion, what progress did it hold?
Well, I mean, during the war, women were playing sometimes to quite big crowds in proper stadiums. Like there was a match at the Hillsborough Stadium in 1921, just before the ban, that attracted over 20,000 spectators. That was between the Dick Kerr ladies, who were one of the top teams at the time. They were from Preston, and the Atalanta ladies, who were based in Huddersfield, but were actually formed by a Sheffield woman called Constance Waller. One of the main consequences of the ban was that they couldn't play in stadiums anymore. They could only play kind of in public parks and things, so they couldn't raise any money. So they couldn't kind of contemplate professionalism or anything like that. I suppose with the ban came a lot of kind of propaganda around how women shouldn't play football, bad for their organs, and all sorts of ridiculous reasons put out about why they shouldn't and couldn't play football. So yeah, who knows where it would have been now if it carried on with the trajectory it had during the First World War.
What broke the barriers down for more acceptance to be sort of made of women's football from like the 70s to now, do you think?
Some people cite the 1966 World Cup and England's victory in that as being quite significant in terms of everyone being interested in football all of a sudden. I'm not sure how true that is, but certainly the 60s were, I suppose, the time when feminism began to be a thing and women started campaigning for more rights generally. So I guess it was part of that, really, the initial impetus for the ban being lifted and everything. But yeah, certainly during the first 20 or so years after the ban was lifted, there was still a lot of prejudice. I mean, I remember once when I was at school, when I was about 11, I think I'd been campaigning for girls to be allowed to play football in PE a bit. And as a result, my young female PE teacher, who you might think should be an ally, she came and did this really long lecture to my whole class about why girls shouldn't be allowed to play football. Yeah, so that would have been about 1979 probably. I was just having to sit there, listen to it, absolutely fuming silently, but I didn't dare say anything.
Steam coming out of your
yeah.
yeah.
But I can't remember what all the reasons were. The only one I can remember is that she'd been at teacher training college with somebody that had played football for England. Nobody seemed particularly impressed. Nobody was really bothered. But I'm sure the England player wasn't bothered that nobody was impressed or bothered, because I don't think that's why anyone played football in those days. It wasn't for the adulation, it's just for the love of the game.
You mentioned Doncaster Bells were one of the teams that formed around that time of when the ban was brought to an end. Are there any other clubs that still exist today that came about around then, or are they mainly clubs that no longer exist?
Well, the Sheffield Wednesday, if you count the Star Ladies pub team from 1971 as having a direct line to the current Sheffield Wednesday team. So yeah, they're almost as old as Doncaster Bells. But yeah, there's a couple in the local area, but not very many. Yeah,
most of them just ceased to exist after a few years of existence then.
I think so. There were a few from the early 70s which were based in factories. So there was Sanderson Kaiser, who were a big steel manufacturers. They had a women's team for about 3 years in the early 70s. Viners, again, cutlery firm, I think, had one about that time. So it may have been the decline of the steel industry and the huge numbers of workers that worked in that industry that maybe played a part in the decline of women's football as well.
Of course, you mentioned that there was massive crowds before the ban came in back in the 1920s. Was that not the case when it re-emerged? Was it almost just back to square one at that point, or was as the clubs sort of came to fruition, was the sport there as well, or did they have to sort of just work from the ground up at that point?
I think they pretty much had to start again from nothing. I mean, I used to play for crowds of about 2 men and a dog, maybe somebody's dad and somebody's partner and a couple of passers-by. That was about it. So yeah, we had to start from nothing really.
What were the crowds like at Sheffield United? Because obviously the men's team would have been getting a good few thousand through the gates of Bramall Lane. Did that in any way translate into the women's side, or not? Not
in my memories, no. Hardly anyone came to see us, but we did get match reports and things in the men's programmes sometimes, so they supported us in that way, raised awareness a bit. Just occasionally, if one of the teams played at a proper stadium, they'd get a bigger crowd, like Wednesday played at Hillsborough once or twice. I think they might even have played kind of before a men's match once, so that would have got a big crowd, but not really for the average Sunday match in the park. Not really, no.
I just wanted to quickly get your opinion before we sort of wrap it up on how you feel sort of seeing these teams develop over this time frame. You know, what's it? I know some of the clubs don't exist anymore, and there's quite a lot of new clubs who are sort of dotted around all of South Yorkshire. But in terms of the development of women's football and the sort of trajectory that it's going to, how do you feel about that?
It's amazing, yeah. I just sometimes wish I was a lot younger, so
So you could play.
yeah, yeah. If only that was the case when I was young.
You might have still a few years left. You never know.
You never know. Could be coming out of retirement again soon for the 11-a-side team. That's a joke, by the way. I did play 11-a-side twice last year, but that's how I know I'm not going to do it again.
What was the struggle in terms of fitness, or?
Yeah, just really, really slow. Yeah, it meant every time I got the ball, I panicked because I could hear these footsteps thundering towards me. I knew they were going to get the ball off me if I didn't get rid of it immediately. Yeah, so yeah, it's fantastic to see it. I just hope it continues. I know there's a lot of adverts going out at the moment for teams looking for players, which does make me wonder sometimes if there's enough players to sustain all the clubs. But the local women's league's got 4 divisions, probably about 10 teams in each, so that's kind of beyond what my wildest dreams were when I was a kid. Yeah, and loads of junior teams as well. So yeah, it just maddens me that it's so hard to run amateur teams, grassroots teams. Pitches are so expensive when there's so much money sloshing around the men's game. You know, it'd be nice if a bit more of that could filter down and kind of, you know, pay for pitch hire and things like that.
It's fascinating sort of hearing the background and the history of women's football from where it was to where it is now over a sort of 100-year sort of period, and the knowledge you have is amazing, really. So thank you for coming on and sort of sharing what is only probably part of your knowledge with the audience and with us. We really appreciate it. Lewis, thank you for your time again today, and watch out over the weekend. Cut that bit out. And watch out over the coming days for the next episode of the South Yorkshire Women's Football Podcast. Ruth, thanks again.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for your interest. Much appreciated. After all these years of being ignored.